Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Robert Cargill, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Iowa, former editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, and one of the most respected biblical archaeologists working today. You have seen him on CNN, History Channel, National Geographic, and Netflix. He has spent his career inside the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient ruins, and the Hebrew text itself. And his research uncovers something buried in Genesis 14 that most people have never been told. The mysterious priest king, Melchizedek, a figure the book of Hebrews uses to explain the priesthood of Jesus Christ, may not be who we always have thought he was. Ancient scribes may have rewritten his identity, and Dr. Cargill traced the evidence through the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Dead Sea Scrolls to show exactly how and why it happened. This conversation will take you inside the text, inside the caves of Qumran, and into the Christ-centered implications of what the ancient world actually believed about this figure. Now, it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today, my guest, Dr. Bob Cargill. Dr. Bob, how you doing today?
Doing well, Johnny. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your time today. This is going to be a fascinating conversation.
I'm hoping so. I like doing this. I love public scholarship. And again, I appreciate the invitation to talk about things that we both love to talk about.
Yes, sir. I really appreciate that we matched today too. I you got that memo, that notification. Make sure we match. All right.
Wardrobing was busy today.
It's a must. It's top of priority.
That's right.
All right. So our conversation is going to be a lot around Melchizedek today. And so let's just jump right in.
Sure.
Melchizedek shows up twice in the Hebrew Bible, once in the New Testament. And yet entire priesthoods, theological systems have been built on top of him. Who is this figure and why does he matter so much?
Yeah. Somebody ought to write a book about this guy, right? Yeah. Melchizedek he's like Enoch in this regard, that because he's only mentioned once or twice, depending on how you interpret Psalm 110, that because he's not defined, it allows for him to be redefined. So the way I tell my students is, imagine like Boba Fett or Hammerhead in the early Star Wars movies, right? If you've got a character, Han Solo or Luke Skywalker, that's, defined a lot, you can't really do a lot with them in subsequent movies, right? But if you get a character that makes one appearance, then you can do many different things with them because they were there, they disappeared, and then you can write Book of Boba Fett, and you can do Mandalorian, and you can do all these different things with them in the fan fiction later. So Melchizedek makes one appearance in Genesis 14, and he kind of, it's whoosh in, whoosh out. And so my first book was, how did he come to be? How did we get Melchizedek in Genesis 14? And then we look at a little bit in the book, is that the same individual in Psalm 110? So we're looking at that. And then, of course, there's this entire reception history. And by the time you get down to the New Testament, you get him in the epistle to the Hebrews. And now by this time, he's got an entire tradition. And what's interesting, and this is the book that I'm working on now, I'm getting ready to send it off, and this will be the sequel, if you will, it's the reception history. Many, many different Jewish, Christian, all of these different groups interpret Melchizedek differently. And so different groups do different things with Melchizedek, and they leverage him to their advantage. So this is what makes him so fascinating, is different groups use Melchizedek to achieve their various goals.
Gotcha. Interesting. I guess that will go right into my second question, which is on a claim that your book makes, that Melchizedek was originally the king of Sodom and not the king of Shalem. So
yeah,
could you walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. This was something that I certainly wasn't the first person to propose it, but what I wanted to do is provide the mechanics for how this came about. Now, Not everybody agrees with this, but I think it's right based upon the redaction of the text. Now, so let me very quickly walk through what's going on here. Genesis 14 is two stories. The first, I gotta call it up. The Genesis 14 is actually a story about Chedorlaomer, this king that comes in with this other group of kings from Mesopotamia, and they're basically going to do a campaign through Canaan. And then there are these other kings that are going to defend themselves. They're probably vassal kingdoms that were paying tribute and then decided one day, as many kingdoms are wont to do, decided to stop paying tribute. And so they're like, well, you can't do that. So they're going to come down and sack them all. And so you've got 5 kings versus 4 kings. And I think there's a lot of good evidence that supports this campaign. This was a historical campaign. And so you've got this historical story. And, to what extent the Bible accurately reflects the story when compared to a lot of the archaeological evidence that we have that supports this story, it seems to be pretty close. And then you get this verse that says, and then Abraham the Hebrew, and it's like, we know he's a Hebrew, right? But Abraham the Hebrew. So then it looks like you've got the insertion of the second story that basically ties this campaign into the Abraham and Lot, or the Abram and Lot narrative. And what this is they're going to sack Sodom and Gomorrah and these kings down here. Lot, of course, is living in Sodom. And when they come down to pillage and punish these guys for rebelling, they take Lot with them. And that's the hook that gets Abram involved. Well, he's got to go rescue Lot. And so he's going to go up there and he's going to rescue Lot, and he's going to return all of these people, all of this booty, these goods that were stolen by Chedorlaomer back to the king of Sodom. Okay, so that's the story. Now, the argument that I make is that it clearly says that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, both of them, died in battle. And so the idea is then, even though it's clearly two stories that have been woven together, this story has to be redacted. And so if the king of Sodom died, who then is the king? Naturally, if you're redacting the story, there has to be some other king. King of Sodom died. Who right. Then is the king that's back there in Sodom? And I argue that if you look at the text and the grammar of the text, and this is a very technical grammatical argument that I make in the book, that it's clear that the text that we have in the second half of Genesis 14, the king of Sodom was Melchizedek. And that was fine for a while, but then Melchizedek comes out and he blesses Abram, and he blesses him by El Elyon, which is a known deity up in the north, Phoenicia. We have other inscriptions that say, bless you by El, and sometimes it's El and Elyon, and sometimes it's El Elyon. But this becomes a euphemism for the Hebrew God. So El Elyon becomes God, El short for Elohim. So El, the deity El that we know from the Canaanite pantheon, becomes just another word for Elohim, for God. And Elyon, which was a deity, becomes the word El, meaning up in so most high. So it becomes a name, another name for God. So he says, I bless you by El Elyon. And then a verse later, they put the divine name. So, Yahweh El Elyon. And so now all of a sudden you've got this king of Sodom blessing Abram. Well, we don't want that. And there's another thing happening, and that is you have the city of Shalem, which is a known entity from the biblical tradition, up in Shechem. So I make another argument in a different chapter that Shalem is a known town up in the north. And you really don't have any stories in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, that tie Jerusalem. There's no mention of Jerusalem in the Pentateuch, unless Shalem is a reference to Jerusalem. So they begin to develop this tradition that Shalem is just short for Jerusalem. when you look
Like
at all of the
Jerusalem.
archaeological evidence, right? When you look
Gotcha.
at all the archaeological evidence, I mean, going back to the Amarna tablets and the execration texts and all these things, Jerusalem is always this very long multisyllabic name. And so I argue that Melchizedek was originally the king of Sodom, and they changed a couple letters to make it the king of Shalem, and that makes him this other king. So now instead of the king of Sodom coming out to say, hey, thank you for rescuing all the people. By the way, just give me the people, you keep all the goods, and I bless you by this. And they've basically separated those in the two people. So now it looks like the king of Sodom comes out, then Melchizedek just appears out of nowhere all of a sudden.
Right.
And it's like, whoosh, and Melchizedek blesses him. And then he tithes, and we don't know which direction the tithe goes. And then Melchizedek, whoosh, disappears. And then he continues this conversation with the king of Sodom. You get this really weird situation.
Right.
Whereas when you look at the grammar, if you understand that it's the same person, then the story makes a whole lot more sense. But because the tradition was the way that the text was redacted and the way that it was received, once you get into the Christian tradition, you've got this whole tradition of Melchizedek having no genealogy, having no father, mother, and it's kind of a precursor to Jesus. That's the general thesis of the book.
No, it's great. That's fascinating. I guess my question would be then, if the scribes changed the name, right, Sodom to the Shalem, what was their theological motivation behind it? Like, what were they protecting?
Well, there's this odd phenomenon. Abram really likes the city of Sodom for some reason, right? So at first you have this story where these men are going to go down to Sodom, and they tell, shall we tell Abram what we're going to do? And he's like, no, don't do that. If I can find 50 people, will you spare them? How about 45? Would you believe 40? You know, he sounds like Maxwell Smart, right? With these guys coming down. How about, and he's negotiating with these guys, and it's very clearly God, right? And he's like, how about if I can find 10 people? Will you spare the city? Yeah. So Abram's really trying to spare the city of Sodom, which is fine because we don't have yet the tradition of, there's lots down there. So he's he's trying to spare the city.
Sure.
Then you have this tradition of he's going to go down and he's going to rescue Lot's down there. He's going to go down and he's going to spare the city of Sodom. And the king of Sodom is going to come out and he's going to have this nice conversation and he's going to get blessed by Melchizedek. And he says, no, just give me the people. You keep all the stuff that you took. And Abram's like, no, you're not going to outrighteous me, right? Nobody's going to say that you made me rich. You keep all the stuff. I just did this because I'm a righteous dude. And so you have these interactions where Abraham really, for some reason, really likes the city of Sodom,
right?
Which was fine until it wasn't, right? Until you have the destruction of Sodom, destruction of Gomorrah. Then all of a sudden you look at it and you go, man, he's not only trying to save this city, but he got blessed by this city. And so then it was, and I have a chart in my book, all of these references to the city of Sodom. Either it was destroyed by fire, it was an incredibly sinful place, with the exception of where Abram is mentioned there in Genesis 14. And so they needed to distance the patriarch. They needed to distance Abram from Sodom and Gomorrah. And so one of the things I think they did was they took Melchizedek and they got him out of there. So the blessing. So he's not being blessed by the king of Sodom. That's rule one. Then the other thing is, the way they did that is they made him the king of Shalem. But now Shalem is a known entity up in the north. So then what you got to do is you got to make Shalem Jerusalem. And so there's another thing that happens in the Bible is that all traditions throughout the Bible tend to get, I don't know if you remember Ross Perot way back in the day. I'm a little older.
Of course I remember Ross Perot.
But he used to say, there's a giant sucking sound, right? That's what he always said. It's about NAFTA, right? Jerusalem, there's always this giant sucking sound where all of these traditions, whether it's the Garden of Eden or whether it's, Mount Moriah or whether they all get tied in Jerusalem. So the sacrifice of Isaac and all of these things end up being associated with Jerusalem. And so Shalem tradition ends up being tied to Jerusalem because the priests want this tradition of, well, even Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, and that was in Jerusalem, so you too should be tithing to Jerusalem.
Right.
When you look grammatically, I think the tithe went the other way, right? Because he's basically, the king is saying, you keep all the stuff. In fact, I'll give you more. You keep the stuff. I just want the people, right? Thank you for saving my people. And so he gave the stuff to Abram. The English translations are often not true to the text because it says, and Abram tithed. The Hebrew doesn't have a proper noun there. It just says, and he gave him. But if you look at the syntax in the imperfect, in the Vav consecutive there, the subject never changes. We're clearly talking about the king of Sodom is doing the tithing. So this is what I think is happening, is they wanted to remove the patriarch from the king of Sodom. And so that's what's going on. But then they have the problem of they want it to be Jerusalem. So then they got to bring it back to Jerusalem.
Gotcha. One of the things where we've just got done teaching on is it's a series that we've done called Words. And what I really did was just, even in some of the popular scriptures, I started to break down just to show the people in the church that, like, when the people I want a word for word translation of the Bible, like, there is no word for word translation of the Bible. You can't. It is impossible to we don't have English words that fully grasps the fullness of these ancient Hebrew, Greek words. So translators take some liberties to try their best to explain what they meant, or in this case, push something else.
That is exactly correct. And not only is that correct, I get asked all the time, what's the best translation? I say, well, you come to the University of Iowa and take Greek and take Hebrew and take Aramaic and learn how to read these texts. Because, by the way, the reason the different translations of English, the English translations are different, is that different committees from different denominations, from different groups, want to interpret certain things differently so that it matches their theological dispositions. So a lot of times you'll see these words. It's not that you don't have an English word for it, but there are idioms. There are phrases that are in the Hebrew Bible that you just can't. You have to supply English words, and that means you're saying things that the Hebrew doesn't say, but you have to say them in order to make the idiom work. Or in the case of Melchizedek here, the tradition was that the tradition became, by the time you get to the first century, that Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. And so a lot of these translations, even though the text does not say that, they will say, and Abram tithed to Melchizedek.
Right.
So the text doesn't say that. So I like to point this out to my students when I'm teaching them Hebrew, is the text doesn't say what the English says. And so be careful, but you're absolutely correct. There's no word for word. You have this phrase, we have this idiom, lost in translation. And it's not just true about English. The Septuagint, right? The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible didn't know what a lot of these words were. They didn't know how to interpret a lot of this stuff. And so oftentimes they make up some phrases. A lot of times they just leave sentences out. They just leave it. They didn't translate it, and they just move on to the next verse.
Right. Real fascinating stuff. All right, let's go over to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know you spent years studying them as well too, and the community at Qumran. For people who have heard the name but do not really understand what the scrolls are, what did we actually find in those caves, and why should it matter to anyone who cares about the Bible?
So the Dead Sea Scrolls, I and other scholars say they fundamentally changed the way that we read the Bible. And the reason for this is what we have is a group of documents that are basically, you can group them in three categories. One of them are the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible that we have by over 1,000 years. That is, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest actual copies of the Hebrew Bible that we had were from the 11th century. And then when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of a sudden you've got copies of the Hebrew Bible from 1,000 years earlier. Meaning, you can look at the stuff that we had, and you can look at the stuff that we've now discovered, and you can see there's pretty faithful copy tradition, right? 99% of these letters are right on the money. So these were people of faith who took copying the Word of God seriously, and they letter for letter they copied this stuff very faithfully. But of course, as a scholar, we want to see that 1% of the letters that was different. And a lot of these, we talked about these translating committees. A lot of them, there's a hole in the manuscript, or we're not quite sure what the original said. Now, all of a sudden, you've got some originals, or at least some very much earlier copies, and we say, "Oh, that's what it actually said." So this is why we tell people don't make sure you buy a Bible that was published after the 1950s, after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because now that apparatus and the bottom of the Bible that has all that little fine print that says, some of the earliest manuscripts say this and this, that now takes into account the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we can say, we used to think this, but now with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that this word is this, because we've got 15 copies of it, of this same, book of Isaiah or something. So that's the first category. The second category are books that didn't make it into the Bible, but that we knew about. Books like Enoch and Jubilees, things like that. Right. So these were books that were non-canonical, but for some reason, this group at Qumran had lots of copies of them. Maybe they were part of their canon. Maybe that was part of their Bible. And in the third group of documents we had never seen before. And they all seem to be congruent in their ideology and their theology, as opposed to the temple Judaism in Jerusalem, and sectarian. So a lot of it, even though they were found in different caves, they seem to talk about an opposition to temple priesthood, and how to join this group. And this is how we worship, and this is how you join the group, and this is how what it meant. And this is, by the way, how we interpret Scripture. And this was a really important thing, because we know that the Christians interpreted, let's say, expired prophecies a particular way. And we know that the rabbis interpreted Scripture and prophecy a particular way. But now you've got a window into a group that we didn't know about that was interpreting Scripture a different way. And so now it opens this whole new world of, Judaism really was diverse in the first century. The rabbis interpreted it this way, the Christians interpreted it this way, and now this group, who most people associate with the Essenes, most scholars say we're not sure, but that's the best candidate. These sectarians interpreted Scripture a different way. And so it just shows you the beautiful diversity of early Judaism.
Sure. Can you, again, for the listeners, our listeners are just new Christians that are interested in study, or skeptics that are interested in study, or just, we have a real thing. The books, First Enoch, Jubilees, the Genesis Apocryphon, what are these writings? And just if you could briefly explain them and what they revealed about Second Temple, what the Second Temple Jews actually believed.
Sure. First Enoch and Jubilees are they're basically attempts at rewriting portions of it, are rewriting the Bible. Now you're like, whoa, what do you mean rewriting the Bible? The Bible gets rewritten within the Bible. So if you read the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and then you get another Bible and you open up to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you're going to read essentially the same story. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written at a later date, but it's telling the same story of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. But a lot of times it cleans it up, or it corrects things, or it adds things, or it tells it a little differently. And a lot of these things that, the contradictions in the Bible, a lot of those are just Chronicles changing the number of something in Samuel and Kings. And it's a later retelling of the story where they're changing a name, or they're changing, but it's basically the same story. By the way, we do this in, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They told the same story 4 times, and some of the details don't match up, but it's essentially 4 different tellings of the same story. They do it all the time within the Bible. Okay. So there came a point where the editors, the redactors of the Bible, 5th century, 4th century, 3rd century, right? There came a point where it's like, all right, we're not going to touch this. We're not going to change the letters now they still did it, but this is a pretty fixed text. We're not going to change it. And a lot of people said, Well, we need to tell the story in a way that the people now can understand it. Maybe we want to write it in Aramaic. Maybe we want to give a little bit more detail. So we get the Targumic tradition where they start rewriting that text into Aramaic, and every once in a while they'll throw in a story or they'll throw in a commentary, and these are the Targums. Mm-hmm. But you'll also get just complete rewrites. So this is Jubilees. This is Enoch. And they're all trying to achieve something differently. Enoch and Jubilees use a different calendar. So they didn't like the calendar that was used by Temple Judaism, the solar lunar calendar. They didn't like the moon, right? The moon was too fickle. It was too feminine. They wanted a calendar that was just the sun, right? The sun comes up, comes down, it's reliable. Now, that calendar is wrong, right? And after a while, you're going to realize we're off a little bit, but they didn't care, right? So Jubilees goes through and it retells the story of Genesis, Exodus. It retells the biblical story, but on a different calendar, right? And it's using the Jubilee years, 49, seven sevens, weeks of sevens. Enoch uses a jumping off point Genesis 6, 1 through 4, right? These sons of God who come down and have sex with the women, earthly women, and they produce these giants, right? And we have this in many different mythological traditions, different cultures, especially the Greek tradition, right? Where the gods have sex with humans and you create these giants, right? And they use that to tell the story of how basically there was a problem with Genesis 6 through 9, the flood story. God, if you read Genesis 6 in the Hebrew, it says that God regretted making humans. And so his solution was, I'm just going to kill everybody and all the animals. I'm going to start over.
Right. Okay,
fine. God gets to do what he wants. He's God. But there came a point later on where people were saying, I got an ethical problem with that. And so what they did was when they rewrote Enoch, they said, no, here's what happened. The sons of God came down and had sex with women. They created these giants, and the giants were eating all of the resources on earth. And when they ate up all of the resources that humans could eat, they then began eating the humans. And God, in his wisdom, realized the only way that he's going to save mankind is he's got to kill these giants. So what he did was he told Noah, build an ark, and he's going to flood the earth, and the flood will kill all the giants. Now, he's going to kill everybody else as well, but they were bad anyway, right? And then he's going to save humanity and start over that way. So in Enoch, God's flooding the earth basically to save humankind. Whereas in Genesis 6, it's like he's punishing humankind. I regret this.
Yeah.
So you can see that. I hate to compare. I mean, I like comparing it to fan fiction and Star Wars, right? A lot of times you have these plot holes in the Bible, just like you have in Star Wars. What do you mean Luke Skywalker can blow up the Death Star with one shot from the outside? Who designed this thing? And then you get Rogue One and they're like, no. He did it on purpose. It was all part of a plan, right? This is what you get when you get these rewriting of the biblical text. When you get Jubilees, when you get Enoch, they're going to say, no. I know it looks bad here in the flood, but here's what actually happened. And then while they're doing it, they'll do it on a new calendar so that it conforms to this group's faith tradition. And that's what it is. They're rewriting. Genesis Apocryphon is another one that you have in Aramaic at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have a lot of these rewritten texts that then were read alongside the biblical texts as kind of either commentaries or that were just replaced them whole cloth.
That is, it's fascinating when you start thinking, it just breaks boxes down, right? Like it breaks understanding, like rewriting the scripture, they're retelling this. And again, it's more along the lines of people thinking or believing that God was up in heaven writing down these letters, throwing it on a paper airplane, catching it inside.
Yeah, no.
And when you express to people, Christians, believers, that no. In the first century, they weren't walking around with their Bibles in their hands.
That's
that
right.
This was formulated later. We should be taking a look. We, as I am obviously a pastor, self-proclaimed Christian, we do not look like the first century Christians in the way we engage with the text, the scriptures. And I think it's a bubble that we just always believe this. We just always had this. So again, just honest study of what we're looking at, I think, is vital.
I agree. And I make this point at the end of my book, The Cities That Built the Bible. The Bible didn't just float down from heaven. I like your analogy, just wrote it and put it on paper airplane. The Bible didn't float down from heaven, right? It wasn't that way. The church existed before the Bible did, right? So the church, faithful Jewish individuals who then believed that Jesus, was the Messiah, they were venerating the Hebrew scriptures. And then they were writing to each other about Jesus. This is Paul's letters. Maybe they wrote some accounts of Jesus's life. And then they were beginning, so maybe one church in Corinth had a letter, and one, Galatia and Ephesus, and they had these different letters. And then hundreds of years later, they begin to, I got this letter. Hey, let's swap. Let's make copies. And they began to pull these together. And then it was hundreds of years later where they began to decide, what do we consider to be the word of God, or what do we consider to be authoritative? But we need to remember that this process takes centuries, and it's the church, it's people of faith who were deciding which books were going to be in the Bible. The Bible didn't create the church created the Bible.
Great point.
People of faith put together this book. They were still writing, they were still editing, they were still redacting. And then once they decided on a canon, they said, this is what we believe. Now let's try to hold true to that. But it was a long period of editing and redacting and deciding and arguing. And what do we believe early on? Because there was so much diversity within the faith. Christianity was never singular belief. There was always, just like Judaism, there was always tremendous beauty and diversity within the early tradition. And I don't think it ever went away, even though we decide. And this is why you'll read in one place in the Bible, it'll say, sell all that you own, give it to the poor, everybody you should get. And then in another place, it'll say, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. There was always a diversity of opinion within the text, and they preserved it all. In the Hebrew Bible, they preserved it all. And there's something that speaks to everybody, because there was this tremendous diversity in the early church, in early Judaism, and they just kind of canonized a lot of it.
Great points.
Yeah.
Great points. All right, we're gonna hit two sides of a coin here. You served as a editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, one of the most respected publications in the field. You have also built a reputation for calling out fake and sensational archaeological claims. What are the most common types of bogus claims people fall for when it comes to the Bible and archaeology?
The claims that people fall for the most are usually the ones that are the quickest answers. So, and what I mean by that is they're the ones that are going to solve all of the problems, with one, the magic bullet, right?
Right.
So when you see a discovery that somebody comes out and they says, we found this thing, and it's going to prove that Moses wrote the Pentateuch and that Hebrew is a lot older than all the other languages. And you just start ticking them off, right? You just like, and it's going to prove that all of these archaeologists that are claiming that they're all wrong, and everything that my group's been saying is correct. And if it almost sounds too good to be true, probably because it is.
Right.
The reason that those are so popular is because they play right into people's faith. And the thing that I have the biggest problem with is individuals who prey, P-R-E-Y, who prey on the faith of honest people of faith, when they prey on that faith to try to get them to either buy things. I really don't like that, to buy tickets or to buy books or whatever, or to get them to believe something that's supposed to be in the realm of faith. And so this is where I really have a problem with apologists.
Sure.
There are some things that are supposed to be in the realm of faith. We don't have evidence. There is no physical evidence of Jesus. We don't have it. We don't have literary evidence, except for the Bible, internal, but outside of the Bible, for Jesus until late first, early second century, references to Jesus. He's very much a figure of faith. We don't have evidence for the patriarchs. We don't have evidence. It's outside of the Bible. These are issues that you either accept on faith or you don't. Now, once you get down into the kings, once you get down into David and Ahab and Omri and Hezekiah, we have all kinds of archaeological evidence. We can do that, and a lot of it corroborates the claims that are made in the Bible. And I teach courses on this, and I love doing this. But when people begin to make pseudo-archaeological claims about the route of the Exodus or about discoveries, that are Rorschach tests that this is where, I try to suppress it, and I try to, always do it on the merits of the argument.
Right.
But I really don't like it when people try to take advantage of people of faith and by giving them something that's clearly not true, that's clearly not following the rules of engagement, the rules of science and methodology, just because they either want their name in the paper or they want them to give money to their organization or they want them to come on their dig with them or something like that.
Gotcha. It's you see it a lot. People want their it's the fight with truth, right? Even Jesus says, the whole Jesus and Pontius Pilate conversation of what is truth. The way I take that to heart, because people want their beliefs affirmed rather than getting their beliefs from what is true. And so I could definitely agree with you in the point of, when people know something's not true and they just keep using it to play on it. We see this all the time. I see it all the time with all the end times predictions, every, flood, earthquake, war, all this stuff is like, oh, this is what, it's just like it'll roll the eye, and then they'll write a book, they'll make $1 million, and then they'll push the goalpost back, and we'll just keep rinsing and repeating without holding anybody accountable. So the flip side of that question was going to be, on the flip side, what are some of the most significant archaeological discoveries that actually do confirm or illuminate in the biblical text?
Yeah. So I came, when I was at the University of Iowa, we created Bible and Archaeology. And so Bible and Archaeology is our YouTube project where we like you hold podcasts and we have discussions of other scholars with their books and their research. And one of the most common things we get is not only please debunk, this latest claim. What do you think about this ridiculous claim that somebody made? But they'll want to know what are, this is very question, what are the pieces of evidence? One of my favorite pieces of evidence is the seal of Hezekiah. Mm-hmm. So we've got this seal with what appears to be Hezekiah's, it's Hezekiah's signature. It's a seal impression. So we have evidence, and that corroborates the Sennacherib prism that talks about Hezekiah being wrapped up like a bird in a cage, right? The siege of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem wasn't taken. Somehow it survived. We have this from 2 Kings 18. We have, I love that piece of evidence. You have the black obelisk of Shalmaneser the First. This is where Omri is bowing down. These aren't flattering pieces of evidence, right? But they're pieces of evidence that show that ancient Israel existed, that there were often vassal kings, vassal kingdoms to the Assyria or Babylon. The decree of Cyrus, the Cyrus cylinder, never mentions Jerusalem, never mentions Jews in particular, but it does give a general decree of emancipation, that all of these people that the Babylonians had bringing in, they can go home. And so while it may not say what Ezra 1 says, right, it may not say exactly those words, it does show that the Persians were willing to set people go back and to rule basically through the temples. So you could see where the story that we have in the Bible is at least made possible. The context is made possible through these. So when I teach my Cities of the Bible course, I walk through these pieces of evidence. The Tel Dan inscription is another great one that I love to talk about. A lot of people want to claim that it's evidence that David existed. Maybe what it is evidence is that an Aramaean king claims to have conquered the king of Israel and the king of this group called the House of David, so Judah, and they referred to themselves as the House of David. So what we do know is that 150 years after David existed, Judah referred to themselves as the House of David. So is that hard evidence that David existed? No, but it's a pretty good circumstantial case that these people called themselves the descendants of David or the House of David. Right. So these are the pieces of evidence. And then, of course, the farther down you get the Pilate stone. It doesn't say that Pilate crucified Jesus, but we know that Pilate existed. We have coins of Pilate. So that's what I like to do. And I think the more that we're honest about the evidence, don't make it say more than it does. Be honest about about the evidence. Then people can judge for themselves.
Sure.
And this is one of the things we do at Bible and Archaeology. We're honest about the evidence, and then people can go and make informed decisions for themselves.
Of course. Right. The cities you wrote about in the cities that built the Bible, places like Tyre, Babylon, Alexandria, Jerusalem, they play a massive role in shaping the scripture themselves. How does understanding some of those cities change the way you read the Bible itself? How does that help?
Yeah, sure. What I tried to do in the cities that built the Bible is try to set up basically the process of creating the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So how did we get the Bible? And what I did was I wanted to tell the archaeological story of these cities as representative of both the people and the material culture that contributed to the manufacture of the Bible. And those early cities, right? The Phoenician cities is where, Biblos is where we get the word for Bible, right? It's Phoenicia is where we get the alphabet that is used. That this Phoenician alphabet is going to end up, it's derived from this early Proto-Sinaitic script that we find, which is kind of a transition from hieroglyphs, hieratic into this script, which becomes the Hebrew script, the Aramaic script, which then you can see go down to the Greek script, which comes down to Latin, all the way down to English. So I wanted to show where does the alphabet, where do the actual letters come from? Where does the papyrus come from? Where does the word for book come from? I then wanted to look at, we looked at Ugarit. So, the transition from cuneiform into this Semitic language, right? Where do these gods come from? Because we read about Baal and Asherah and Anat and Yam and Mot, and we read about them where usually the prophet screaming at the Israelites, stop worshiping them. Please, for the love of God, stop worshiping these other gods. And you're like, well, yeah, but what do you mean other gods? So the Ugaritic texts that I walk through show us where these gods came from, why they were so popular. So that's what I try to do, is say, this is the physical evidence. This is where we discovered them. This is what these texts say. This is what they tell us. It tells the story of the origin of Baal, right? We always read Baal's terrible, stop worshiping Baal. Okay, what's the backstory? Right. So I'm trying to do what Disney's doing with Star Wars, right? They're going in and telling I try to tell the backstory of all this stuff in my book. And then we look at like Nineveh. So you can tell the story of Jonah. So what's Jonah actually say? Is it about a big fish, or is it trying to say something else? So I try to go through each of these cities, and then I tell the story of ancient Israel and of the New Testament, but I'm also telling the story of how the Bible was put together at the same time.
That's fascinating. I think like piecing together, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, specifically when it comes to archaeology and even evangelism or faith and all of this type of stuff. It's when you say, let the archaeology just speak without adding things to it, where you could find something that proves somebody exists, like Hezekiah, right? But just because you found something that proves that Hezekiah existed doesn't mean that he then did A, B, C, D, and E. So this is proof that he did do all. No, all we got proof is that he existed. So that's the lane. And whether you want to go and put those pieces together for yourself, You put those pieces together for yourself, but let the archaeology speak for itself.
That's it. And this is where I say, if you're a confessional person, if you're a person of faith, I think it's better as a scholar to present the evidence that we have. Here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And this is how you earn trust with people. I'm not going to claim that this artifact, this material object, right, says more than it does. This is what it says. Now, if after I show you all of this evidence, if you want to build a circumstantial case that, oh, well, then therefore, even though we don't have any hard evidence that Jesus existed, man, I can make a pretty good case that this rabbi from Galilee existed and he got some followers, and man, the stuff he did and the stuff that they did in his message changed the world. And I want to believe in that. If you want to do that, that's fine. But I'm never going to lie to my audience. I'm never going to lie to my students about the material that we have. I certainly am not going to claim to have discovered something that is not going to pass through peer review, that is not going to follow standard archaeological methodology, just so I can say everyone else is wrong, I'm right, and you should come dig with me and you should buy my books. I think you be honest and let things that are in the realm of faith remain in the realm of faith. At the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about acting in good faith, whether you're a confessional person or not.
Right. Dr. Cargill, this has been great. I got one more question, and it's a tough one, and I'm not going to ask you to come from a theological perspective here, but again, just a straight one, because I know you spent your career navigating this space of rigorous scholarship and faith, and a lot of people in our audience are pastors, church leaders, and they love the Bible deeply.
Yep.
What would you say to someone who is afraid that digging into the academic side of Scripture might damage their faith?
Yeah, this is a good question, right? The joke is once you go to seminary, you lose your faith, or once you start. I have plenty of confessional colleagues, right? So a lot of my colleagues that I work with, that I dig with, are pastors, are work at Christian universities, work at Jewish universities, right? At the end of the day, I think, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I think you have to do what's best for you, and you have to act in good faith. And if you are honest with the material that you have, and you can then say, I know this is what the text says, right? The earth was created in 6 days, but I also know that the science doesn't support that. But I also know that this was the story that they had, and it was the best they had before we have science. This is why I say, don't try to solve the problems with apologetics. Apologetics is not going to get you where you want to go, whether you're a person of faith or not, right? Apologetics is not the answer. Understand that they wrote down stories based on what they had. They wrote down Genesis 1 based on this tradition. They wrote down Genesis 2 based on this. They had this flood story, and they put that at the beginning. This is the history. They were telling their stories. But what are they actually trying to do? They're trying to tell the story of their people. They're trying to infuse that story with their ethics, what they believe, what happened to them. And it's Israel, right? It's literally, they're struggling with God. They're struggling to understand who they are, their place in the world, and what's their relationship with this God. And at the end of the day, aren't we all just trying to do that, right? It's why am I here? How can I make the best life for my kids? What does it all mean? That's what, at the end of the day, we're all trying to do. And so I think if we're honest about that, if you can come to a place where you can read the Bible in a way that says, yeah, I see what it says. It's okay to own slaves, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to take that literally. I'd say, no, I know that's what it says, but I'm not going to do it. And I know it says 6 literal days, but I'm not going to do that. But I am going to hold on to some of these things. Some of these things I believe. I believe this. I used to have, I like to tell the story of my first boss in Israel, Vasilius Seferis, of blessed memory. He was the director of excavations and surveys for the state of Israel. He was a Greek. He used to be a monk, right? He was a deacon in the church. And he was a faithful guy, right? But he was also the director of excavations and surveys. And I asked him one day, as I was going through my Master of Divinity, I said, Vasilius, how do you believe these Greek Orthodox traditions, and yet you know the archaeological tradition? How do you reconcile this? And he said, I'm Greek. That's what we believe. And I didn't get it at the beginning. And then I said, that's actually the best answer I've ever heard. He said, this is the science. And I operate and I live in every aspect of my life in a world that is bound by science and math and reason and logic. And you can't ignore that. But I'm also a person of faith. And it's a miracle. What I believe that this guy died and that he resurrected. That's a miracle. You can't prove miracles. So why try? This is what I believe. So I live in a scientific world, and I believe this miracle took place. I'm Greek. I believe it. That's what my community believes. This is my tradition. And then he lit up a cigar, as he was wont to do, and we sat down on the beach there and we smoked cigars. And that was the end of my attempt to pursue anything in apologetics.
Right.
Because he made it that simple. He says, of course science is real. Of course scientific methodology is real. You can't ignore math and ignore science. You also can't prove miracles. You either believe this or you don't. And trying to prove all of these miracles and the sun standing still, you can't do. Just accept it. This is the faith tradition. You can't prove it. So stop doing apologetics and just say, I'm a person of faith. And when I die, I hope to God that this is what I'm investing my eternal soul in. I believe this. And for all the other aspects of my life here, I'm going to live to be the most righteous person I can be. I'm going to follow the rules of science. I'm going to take my medicine. I'm going to listen to my doctors, and I'm going to help my kids live a better life than I had. And I that was the best advice I ever had.
Really, really amazing time today, Dr. Cargill. You've been so generous with your time and your wisdom and knowledge. We're going to link all your books up in our description section. But again, can't thank you enough for your time today.
Thank you, Johnny. I really, really appreciate the time with you. Great questions today.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In Podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.